Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining us around the world. And welcome to part 2 of the e-panel discussion series, Coronavirus at the Crossroads of Faith and Science, presented by the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry of the United Methodist Church. Our topic today is, does the end-of-life ministry need to be in person? My name is Reverend Greg Berquist, and I'm the General Secretary of the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry. I will be the moderator for the discussion, and I'm joined today by 2 experts in end-of-life medical and pastoral care. Calling in from Memphis, Tennessee, we have Dr. Austin Dalgo. Dr. Dalgo is a palliative care specialist at Le Bonheur Children's Hospital and assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. He employs his expertise in end-of-life care as a member of the ethics team for the Methodist Le Bonheur healthcare system. Dr. Dalgo earned his medical degree from the University of Alabama School of Medicine and also holds master's degrees in theological studies and bioethics. Welcome, Dr. Dalgo.
Thanks for having me, Greg. I'm honored to be here, and I think that this is such an important discussion for us to have right now because we really are in a catch-22 with the coronavirus. We both need to be there for patients at the end of life because we are embodied individuals, and also we need not to be there because we need to protect vulnerable people. And so this is a really important discussion that I think we're having today so that we can maybe develop some clarity, at least begin to develop some clarity about the right questions to ask.
Yeah, thank you very much, and again, welcome. Joining us from Evanston, Illinois, we have Reverend Dr. Trina Armstrong. Dr. Armstrong is an assistant professor of pastoral care and counseling and pastoral theology at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. She's a licensed psychotherapist and an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Dr. Armstrong earned her MA and PhD in practical theology and spiritual psychotherapy from Claremont School of Theology. She also holds a Master of Divinity degree and a master's in psychology, marriage, and family therapy. Welcome, Dr. Armstrong.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really good to be here and to participate in this conversation. It is definitely an important conversation, particularly for clergy all over the world who have had to, rethink their ministries, particularly their ministries in pastoral care, considering all the shifts and changes that COVID-19 has introduced in all of our lives. And this topic on hospice and death and how we do ministry is perfect opportunity to help us to think about it and offer some suggestions, guidelines, some things that pastors can do even with the obstacles. So I'm very grateful to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm realizing that best practices in this area are new practices for us, and this conversation will be important for us. So thank you for being here. We chose today's topic because in a time when so many of our normal rituals are being disrupted, perhaps one of the most difficult changes is the inability to sit beside a loved one in the hospital at the end of their life. This is a familiar ministry for most clergy. Having a pastor there to share the hope of resurrection in those final moments can bring peace to the patient and to their family. Yet, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, clergy are not simply messengers of the good news, they could also be potential vectors for this deadly virus. Before we begin our questions on this subject, I want to remind our audience that we will also be taking some questions live near the end of the panel. I am so glad that you are joining us today, and we want to try to address as many of your questions as possible. So if you have a question, please post it in the comments section of either the Facebook or the YouTube live feeds. So let's go ahead and dive into the questions for our panelists. This is actually for both of you. Can you talk to us more broadly about some of the benefits of end-of-life ministry with patients and their families? For instance, does it have any tangible impacts on mental health or peace of mind? And Dr. Armstrong, perhaps you can begin for us.
Yeah, great questions. Having been a hospice chaplain for about 7 years for a national hospice when I was living in California, I definitely have some things to say about that. Hospice ministry is such a sacred opportunity to accompany people who are, dying from various illness to the end of their life. I akened it to the sacredness of childbirth. As a mother myself, I know how sacred it is to welcome a child into the world, and how we ritualize that as a celebration, but not often in the face of death. And so hospice is one of those kinds of programs that humanizes this process in very powerful ways for families. We use the word quite frequently of dignity in helping patients die with dignity. No matter what the stage of their illness was, whether it was cancer or pulmonary or whatever, we provided patients with an opportunity to explore some of the fears and concerns that they had about death and dying. And we talked about it. Oftentimes, we don't talk about death. And particularly as ministers, we look forward to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, of course. That is such a foundation of our faith. But not recognizing that also an important part of that is this period where, Jesus was dying on the cross, and what do we do with that? And so there's the sacredness, particularly for clients who are somewhat lucid. The range of lucidity, of course, is great for some who are non-responsive, but nevertheless, it is an opportunity to bring peace and comfort for those that are able to explore the things that are going on in their lives. It's a way to address any regrets. It provides patients with an opportunity to talk about their fears. It is definitely improved quality of life. Chaplains work in conjunction with doctors and nurses as a whole palliative team. And so it provides a community of support. Oftentimes, people who are heading towards the end of their life don't always have the support of family or friends or a community, even a church community for that matter. But the hospice community the hospice team becomes this person's family, and chaplains are an integral part of that journey for many patients. And I think in terms of mental health, one of the things that I often saw was this anxiety that was present with patients that often trumped some of the medication that was prescribed to them to counteract some of that, right? The spiritual distress. And the chaplain, in my role as a chaplain, was able to help the team to understand the spiritual distress in ways that we can comfort the patient in the midst of that. And so I think there are a number of different benefits. Ministry of presence, right? There's nothing like the ministry of presence that is really on full display in hospice ministry, to validate what's going on with clients, to deal with, life journeys and opportunities to even ritualize some of those thoughts and feelings that clients have about dying. So I think ultimately, I won't say any more than that. I'll offer more as we continue that conversation, but definitely dignity, peace, comfort, fears about death and dying and suffering and listening and validating and just being present are some really wonderful things that hospice ministry offers patients during this sacred time. It is a sacred time. Death is the end of life, and so it's a beautiful way to ritualize that in the same way that we celebrate death. I mean, the birth of children. We offer this sacred moment for our clients who are ending their lives, or patients who are ending their lives. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the way you connected birth and death. I mean, that's so much a part of our own Wesleyan tradition that we believe in holy birth, holy living, and holy dying. But sometimes we don't engage the holy dying part as well as we do the others. So I think that's a wonderful reminder of who we are, even as Wesleyan people. So, Dr. Dalco, how would you address that same question from a medical perspective?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we medical doctors tend to think about is the word that you mentioned, which is tangible. What are the tangible benefits of end-of-life ministry? And I think one of the things that we see, and I'm going to go back to hospice history, is Cicely Saunders. So she was sort of the pioneer for in-person hospice ministry, and she started St. Christopher's in England. And she realized that her patients were in a lot of pain, and the medications that the doctors were giving weren't relieving the pain. And so Cicely was smart enough to bring in chaplains, to bring in social workers, and say, maybe part of this pain that patients are experiencing is actually related to their spiritual condition. And I think that that's absolutely, and so people didn't need their medicines anymore. They didn't need as much pain medicine because their anxieties and fears, as Dr. Armstrong mentioned, were being addressed. And so I think that there are tangible benefits even in what dose of medicine you need at the end of life to treat your pain. I also think that there's a big part of palliative care that I like to talk about with my learners is regret mitigation. So what we want to do is talk to families, talk to patients, and say, what is it that fits your goals in your life in terms of the end of your life? How do we match that holy birth, holy living, holy dying? How do we match that together in your dying process? And so making sure that patients and families don't receive excessive or burdensome medical care at the end of life. And so I think that end of life ministry of let's be honest, let's talk about what your life goals are at the end is such a tangible benefit in terms of regret mitigation for the dying person, but also for the family. And then obviously bereavement is a big part of the dying process as well. In families who aren't able to experience the dying process of their loved one in a way that is comforting and controlled and peaceful, oftentimes have more complicated bereavement and complicated grief that they have to process later on in life. And so to me, one of the tangible benefits of end-of-life ministry is mitigating that complicated bereavement, going through normal bereavement, which is different for every person, but really kind of that incarnational ministry of presence, as Dr. Armstrong said, is a really, I think, extremely important and extremely tangible benefit to doing end-of-life ministry. And so, as a physician and as a part of a hospice team, I see myself as, in all of our team, as sort of interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary, because oftentimes I have nurses or social workers or chaplains saying, hey, Dr. Dalgo, don't you want to change this in terms of your medication regimen? Or I might be coming to the chaplain or the social worker and say, hey, the patient told me that they were thinking about this part of the dying process, or this part of making peace with this family member. Can you help them think through that? And so that transdisciplinary approach, I think, is a really important part of what we do in another really important sort of ministry. And especially, as Dr. Armstrong said, patients who don't have community, in a sense, hospice does come in and function as this kind of makeshift community for patients at the end of their life.
Yeah, thank you. And I love the way you described it as a hospice team, interdisciplinary, all working together. I think that's key. And the notion of regret mitigation. As a pastor for many years, there's a lot of, if only I had done this, if only I had not done that. And to engage that kind of honest conversation with the patient, the family, I think is just an absolutely important step in this process. So, Dr. Dalgo, while the next question is while the scale of coronavirus isolation for patients is new, I imagine that hospitals have previously confronted ethical questions about allowing pastoral care in ICUs or other areas where patients' immune systems are especially weak. Prior to the pandemic, did your ethics team have any standing guidance about this type of situation?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. To be totally honest, we didn't have standing guidance about this because we weren't ever in the midst of a pandemic, at least in my lifetime. I would be very interested to know what in 1918 the rules were about chaplains and spiritual care folks coming into patients' rooms. I will say Memphis, actually, where I'm from, has a history of the yellow fever epidemic coming in the late 1800s. And we actually have a park dedicated to medical providers and clergy who went and took care of dying patients who had yellow fever at the risk of their own lives. And it's actually called Martyrs Park because they risked their lives to take care of the dying and put themselves at risk, even though we didn't know exactly how yellow fever was passed at the time. They knew that getting near somebody who had it put them at risk. And so there's absolutely historical precedent for pastoral and medical providers coming in and putting themselves next to patients in these situations. But in terms of our hospital policy or ethics policy, before the pandemic, what we really viewed chaplains as essential workers in the hospital. We understand our hospital system is a Methodist system, and we understand that we can't take care of patients just in their body. We are a psychosomatic unity, and we can't separate mind and body, spirit and soul. It's all one. And so we allowed chaplains to go in wherever the physicians were. And so as long as they gowned appropriately and put on the right personal protective equipment, they were welcome in those places, even with patients with weakened immune systems. Obviously, we respect family and patients' wishes accordingly, but our system expressly allows that to happen because of the foundations of believing that humans are not just flesh and bones, but also spirit and soul.
Thank you very much. So Dr. Armstrong, your career includes 7 years as a hospice chaplain. What impact does end-of-life ministry have specifically on the patient's circle of loved ones, their family, and their friends?
So it's a really good question and somewhat complex in some ways, but not really, because families, I think, in the face of death and dying, can be very stressful on families, and so often, gauging the way in families are involved. Like some hospice patients would often have families who were living in other parts of the country, or they weren't connected to their families at all. And so, of course, working with a hospice team is always helpful, particularly social workers, who are often the ones who, do initial assessments around sort of the social aspects or the family aspects of how families are involved and the extent in which families are educated on ways that they can be a voice in the patient's care is very important. I think from a chaplain's perspective, really it's supporting the work that social workers do in that way to provide families with opportunities to talk about their own fears and concerns about their loved ones' impending death. Also, some of the challenges that families often have is, again, coming to terms with the reality of death and making the kinds of decisions that are important for that. So, for example, the advance directive is often one of the things that hospice patients have to fill out to determine what is going to happen at the time of death, or whether it's like do not resuscitate order or those kinds of things. And oftentimes, patients would, if not formally, informally tell their family members what their desire and wishes are at the end of their life. Of course, if they don't say that, then it's up to the family member to make those kinds of decisions in the event that the patient isn't able to do that. And so that very beginning stage of admissions for hospice patients and their families is really crucial to providing the ongoing care in the reality that the patient is going to die. It's the hardest thing, hardest information to convey, even in the admission of hospice. It's this reality, right? We assume that just because they go onto hospice, that there's this automatic acceptance. And for some, I find that those who are really connected to their faith in important ways or surrounded by supportive faith communities, and the patient definitely is very grounded in their faith, those families tend to have a better job of, accepting the death and, ritualizing and accompanying their loved one to the end of their lives. And, after that, they very rarely will want bereavement support, but those are sometimes not the majority of folks who are on hospice. So it's very unique and complex in some ways, and so it really is just having that first conversation of coming to terms with the reality of death, and then providing that ongoing support in the same way that chaplains will visit patients, is in the same way that they will visit family members. And the goal really is to empower them to be an integral part of that patient's care, depending on where they're at. And so my work as a hospice chaplain, I worked in long-term care facilities and also homes. And so the diversity of care is definitely different along those two spheres. And then everything else in between, of course, encountering hospice patients who were in inpatient settings in hospitals as well. And so the variety of support, or the kind of support that you give families, varies according to those contexts. I found that a lot of patients who are long-term care facilities often didn't have the regular presence of their families, and some even may have been a little bit disconnected from their families. So a lot of reconciliation kinds of things was happening with family members who may have felt guilty that they weren't quite present, or there was some longstanding issues and concerns with family members over the course of their lives, particularly with children, surviving children. And so really it's a lot of counseling and helping family members to process some of those unfinished things that are tied to the patient. Doing the anticipatory grief is that grief that we feel when we anticipate that someone is going to die, and really starting the bereavement counseling at that point. Sometimes it involves helping them with funeral arrangements, if that wasn't something that they had taken care of, and really helping them to make those decisions, particularly if it was a single, only child, or someone who didn't really have a whole lot of financial resources and just didn't really know how to navigate not only the hospital or the hospice, organizations, but how do they plan funerals and how to think about funerals. And so I did a lot of funerals for families who weren't connected to church communities. And so I think that it's really for those families who are involved, and even those who may have sort of strained relationships, it really is an opportunity to take a very intentional role, listening to them, even in the face of discord or whatever the role is. And oftentimes, again, as I was talking about sort of the sacredness, when the patient is living the last hours, this way in which families can come together, even in their differences. If there are multiple children who have had very different relationships with their loved one, and having this opportunity to come together, even if it's for these last moments. And there was a lot of rituals around the bedside, and opportunities to write, and opportunities to do kinds of creative things to talk to their loved one, for those who weren't able to communicate in that ways. And even, the impact of the death on their lives going forward, how they're going to make decisions. Oftentimes there was property involved, in housing, and so many situations that I think families benefit, again, from this team, from this ongoing support that they wouldn't get otherwise, right? Because grief brings out some very uncomfortable emotions. And so really is an opportunity to support families in that journey in ways that they wouldn't have had that kind of support if it not had been for their hospice journey. So I think families really benefit from the multi-level of supports that they have, even in making decisions like feeding tubes and resuscitation and kinds of things that they get when, they have problems coming to terms with, and they want to do sort of this, they want to keep their family members alive. And it really is sort of having these hard conversations with family, but sacred conversations that listens to their concerns and fears and validates them, but at the same time provide the kind of spiritual guidance where they can make some informed decisions and not feel that they are alone in it, right? That you have someone or a whole team that's walking with you. And I find often that reassurance, that validation, that care was really, really important for families. And it continues even after the patient dies, right? There's a whole bereavement support that they're given up to 18 months. And so just really, I think hospice is such a wonderful program for families in the face of often what can be very difficult decisions and challenges and emotions that arise in the context of a loved one coming to the end of their life. So yeah, a lot of benefit for families in this way.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Armstrong. I think you did a beautiful job, describing the sacred season that death brings in, how we're all involved with that. So it brings me to kind of a follow-up question, Dr. Dalgo. It's that's in best case scenario, we want to do all of that, but we're now living during a time of pandemic, and I'm sure that current hospital visiting restrictions may be particularly painful in a pediatric hospital like yours. So how are you seeing healthcare systems address these spiritual and familial care gaps? Are there any scenarios, even during the pandemic, where clergy or family members are considered essential as in-person caregivers as part of this hospice team?
Yeah, that's a great question, Greg, and thank you for asking. I think that our hospital system, and I think most hospital systems around the country, see spiritual caregivers and family caregivers as essential, even in this time. I think that a lot of hospitals right now, if you just go on the internet and look, have a no visitation policy. And that's actually true for most adult hospitals, No visitors allowed really at all. But their pediatric hospitals like mine oftentimes have a clause or an exception that says, these are children and children shouldn't be in a room by themselves. And so we will allow we'll allow one caregiver to room in with the patient. And so that's one sort of exception that we've made for kids, is to say, there's a family member or guardian should be in there with the child, because we understand, again, with children's health care, that it's very different, and that the kids really need their parents to do things like eat and get dressed and really thrive as an individual. So there's this community aspect of pediatric care that I think is a lot of times missing in adult care. And honestly, if I think about it long enough as a psychosocial provider, I think, well, maybe we should allow one room in caregiver even in adult hospitals. But then we're doubling basically the population of a hospital by doing that, and that again raises some public health concerns. The other thing I will say is that we do have exceptions. Besides just the pediatric exception, there's end-of-life exceptions that we have. And those exceptions are basically saying when we think a patient is dying, we are going to allow more people to come in and see them than we would if the patient were in a routine hospitalization. And so what we have done is created a policy that says we're going to let people go in small groups for short periods of time, family members, to go see the patient. The other thing is, for a period of time in our hospital system, we didn't have chaplains going into the room. They were all doing televisits. And part of a policy group that I was on recently, we said, this is really unacceptable. We need to have chaplains and potentially soon child life specialists come in and be able to be with patients and families at the end of life. And so we actually have gone through the process of getting all of our chaplains fit tested, which is making sure that the mask fits them correctly, the N95 mask, and allowing them some time to spend with patients, especially at the end of life. And so I would say that our system has really seen families and spiritual caregivers as essential. And we've also made exceptions for outside pastors to come in and visit patients at the end of life as well, on special request. And so I think acknowledging that as essential is really an important part in this pandemic. Now, there are all of these sort of qualifiers to that with exposure. And so we've even made the rule, so everybody has to wear a mask, of course, but then we've also even said, if the patient happens to be COVID positive, we're going to allow a small group of people in PPE as healthcare workers do, to come in and see their loved one as well. And so we've even gone that far to say PPE works, and we know it works because I've been around COVID patients quite a bit and I haven't gotten it yet. And the studies show us the same thing, but even allowing family members to put the PPE on and see their loved ones at the end of life has been a part of our conversation.
Yeah, and I appreciate your embracing the hard balance between public health and end of life care. And the fact that you're really kind of living into it and not assuming that a particular rule or guidance right now is applicable in all cases. So I think that's what we're called to do.
Yeah. One of the things that we mentioned in one of our policy guidelines was about visitation at the end of life during the pandemic was we need to readdress this about once every month or two to make sure that we're still, this guidance right now makes sense in a month. And I know when the pandemic and the no visitation rules started coming down, that was back in, I don't know, March or April. And I remember looking back at that and a couple months ago and thinking, man, this doesn't really make sense at all anymore. And so the need to sort of continually think about this and be dynamic in our thinking is something I think that the pandemic has really stressed. And that idea of sort of getting something done and then just sitting back and letting it happen is not really a luxury that we have right now. And that's especially challenging at the end of life because life is already chaotic at the end of life. As Dr. Armstrong said, there's a lot of dynamics, a lot of emotional dynamics going on. Family members trying to come in and make peace, or uncertainty about the prognosis, or just dealing with these very hard conversations. And then you throw on top of it the fact that we're changing our policies every month or so. That really throws people off a lot. And so I think seeing families and spiritual care as essential caregivers really provides at least a little bit of an anchor in this very sort of uncertain time.
Right. And Dr. Armstrong, I'm wondering if you could address essentially the same question, but thinking of the clergy as essential caregivers, and also the other side of that. Do you have any guidance for clergy on how they might offer end-of-life care and comfort when they can't be in the room? So if you could think about that with us for a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So Dr. Delgado shared a lot of different, just kind of being on the ground and in the hospital. He has a definite perspective that, can be helpful to clergy who are now having to rethink how they do pastoral care, right? I think, like Dr. Delgado said a few times, we're all having to do something different, right? Oftentimes without having an opportunity to, sit around the room and, think and plan and, take advantage of the luxury of time we think we have. And in this scenario, it's like you have to do this right away. There were no choices. I know, in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is true for many clergy across the world, a lot of the focus was just how do we continue to do church, and, trying to learn, technology like Skype and Zoom. And, I think just having that transition period was tough for a lot of clergy. I'm in the process of administering and supporting a grant provided by the Luz Foundation to some clergy on the south side of Chicago, just to help them to process some of the mental health challenges of this transition. And the thing is that ministry didn't stop. You do have these end-of-life patients who are still being admitted to hospice, and even some in their own congregations. And so there is no luxury of not doing pastoral care in this situation. And what do we do when we can't be present in the room is the question, right? And some of the ways that pastors can do that is very similar to the ways that they're supporting their own congregations now, right? In terms of, one of the big things is using this technology in ways that can create that kind of connection. But a lot of these connections to patients who are responsive, considering that some patients just simply aren't going to be responsive. And so we have to rely on those folks who are in the room, or family members who can get in, like Dr. Delgado says. Seems to be some policy in letting family members in, and even some clergy to that extent. And so I think now maybe that's the case more than when the pandemic first started. But it's really taking advantage of, how do we do rituals from a distance, and things like prayer and continuing those kinds of things. I think really helping patients tap into some of their own spiritual resources. Music is something that is always a good option. Sending scripture and prayer, by mail or through other means are some good suggestions to offer that kind of spiritual support that cannot be done in person. And just really being mindful of the ways in which clergy provide care in general, right? Just being prepared to answer some of the hard questions in different ways, whether that's by Skype or FaceTime or whatever those are for patients who can be somewhat responsive, or helping the family members who can get in the room facilitate some of those kind of interactions, and sending bulletins if they're attached to a church or a congregation for communion and the ritual, the sacrament of communion, ways to, as safe as possible to do that. I know what we're doing with my church is we're having communion on our own. So we create our own wine and juice. And so that would be something that, clergy can do for, to support, end of life care in that way, the way in which the resources in the room become the most powerful thing that we have. Right. And how do we tap into that as clergy in ways that can be just as sacred? Right. Then our physical presence, of course, physical presence is something that we value. And as a professor, I definitely teach that. And so it's something that I have to think about as I'm preparing to teach my students in the fall about now, what does ministry look like when we cannot be present? And how do we get creative in ways that, as we know, God's presence can still be evident even if we're not in the room? And so how do we make that clear to patients who are perhaps missing that connection in some way? So it's not just the end of life. It's also sort of this way in which the grieving aspect can be exasperated in these situations. And so really just being more attentive to that as well, without the option of having a clergy or limited family members who sometimes provide the spiritual care to family members as well. But it really, I think, taking advantage of these creative ways in which we can offer support, scriptures or notes, just to let that person know that they're not alone, and just really being phone calls are things that they're very helpful. I sat on a panel when the pandemic first started by the Hospice Foundation of America. So I recommend that anybody who's doing ministry tap into that. They do have the recording and all of the other information that they share, which was really wonderful about now some of the ways in which clergy can do virtual ministry. So thinking of now adding that repertoire to the ways in which we do pastoral care, because it's not going to go away. We don't have no idea when this pandemic is going to ease itself. And so it's something that we do have to acclimate ourselves to and really think about how can we make God's presence evident in the room and really tap into patients' own resources. Now, for the ones who are non-responsive, maybe a little bit more challenging, but some of the same principles can apply. Music was often something that we brought to patients, whether it was their favorite gospel song or favorite, music, whatever the Christian music, or something that brought them comfort by just hearing that, we would bring that to them. And so that's something that can also be facilitated with the folks on the ground. So now it's really a very intentional partnership with, these essential workers who are in the hospital in ways. And that's something that has been going on in, Dr. DeGaul's talked about the history of hospice. I think one of the things I've participated in a number of different discussions and lectures with people who are doing palliative care and hospice care on how to get, nurses and doctors to be more attentive to spiritual care. That's not just a chaplain thing or a clergy thing, that spiritual care can be done by all of us. And so now how do we tap into that as a real resource now in this moment in time? And I think when we are all having to partner together and collaborate on ways in which we can provide this care and not be so dependent on clergy. So I think it's really just developing a different mindset or a different way of looking at how we do care in ways that, the whole community is now essentially, responsible for the care of our end of life patients. Yeah. So, and I'll be talking about this with my students as well, right? How do we now do listening skills and take advantage of these technologies in ways that we have not done before? And I think that's going to be an essential tool now for a lot of students as they're preparing to go into ministry. So definitely looking forward to those conversations and having to rethink how I teach pastoral care now, right? There's literally no resources on how to do this. And so I'm in the process of writing a chapter on pastoral care and pandemics. And so, hopefully there's going to be a resource coming out soon. Definitely not by the end of the year, but definitely probably sometimes next year that it will be a resource for those of us who are now having to be in this situation. So yeah, that's sort of some of the things that I think may be helpful for clergy in this moment.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's really important. In fact, I'm going to begin shifting to some of the questions that are showing up on Facebook and YouTube. Dr. Armstrong, you actually addressed one of the questions about how's the grieving process changing? And I think you did a marvelous job of wondering about that and realize that it has to become more expansive, that we have to use the creative tools around us. And that this is new. We have to think about it and pray about it together. And I think that's a really important thing.
Mm-hmm. And Greg, one of the things that I will say, I was looking at the United Methodist statement on death and dying before this, and one of the words that were the phrases that was used was, we want to give companionship to those who are going through the hard work of death, and I think that that's a really poignant phrase. One is the companionship piece. And so we need to think about what companionship looks like if we're not able to be physically present in the room. And I know for people like me who eschew social media and eschew technology, that's a hard transition to make. But I also think that that we have to do this companionship. And I know in ethics, I've dealt with a lot of situations where, one, I would normally be meeting with somebody face to face and talking through the things that they see is a problem going on in the care of their loved one. I don't get a chance to do that. So we don't get the opportunity to develop that sort of personal rapport that we want. But also, I think that in the hospital, we're seeing right now significant issues with the fact that families can't be in the room with their loved one, and the physicians are very busy seeing many, many people throughout the day, and they may not be communicating as well as they should with families. And so a lot of times families will go a day or more and not hear what's going on with their loved one, and then the next call they get is either that their loved one is near death or has passed away. And so the last time they saw their loved one was when they were walking around and they were fine. And then all of a sudden they get this news. And that opens up a whole can of questions about what happened in the hospital. Can I trust the medical team? Who is there looking out for the best interests of my family member right now? And so I do think that in the midst of doing everything we can, the need to communicate and the need to adapt to these new technologies, even for people who are reluctant, who are dragging their feet, we have to do that because the trust issue is a huge issue that we need to deal with in this time and in healthcare in general.
I think that's an excellent point. So from Jim on YouTube, he asked a really good question. It's very practical, very down to earth, and basically say facilities are in lockdown. And he has a parishioner who has been caring for her husband at home, but realizes that she's no longer able to. But she's afraid, and I get this fear, she's afraid that if he goes to a facility, she will never see him again. So what suggestions do you have for her to how to make this decision or how to find peace with the decision? And I think this is to both of you.
Yeah. So I'll start, if that's okay, Trina, because
go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So actually, in my family, we have a similar situation going on. So my dad is on hospice, and my mom is his primary caregiver at home. And we actually had a scare recently where my mom thought she might have had COVID, and so she was wondering, what do I do if I get COVID? How do I quarantine myself so that he doesn't get sick, or how do I care for him if I'm feeling sick? And so that is I can very much sympathize with that question, because that's almost the exact same situation that my family dealt with. And honestly, I don't think that it's a catch-22, just like I said at the beginning. Like there doesn't feel like there's a right answer here. It's you're stuck between two very hard decisions. One is, do I keep trying to care for my loved one even though I feel very overwhelmed, or do I ask for help? I know if you're on hospice, you get respite, right? You have a 5-day
Hmm.
respite that
Right.
you can use every 90 days. And so if that's the case for this parishioner, they should absolutely use that 5-day respite. Um,
Mhm.
if it's possible that they can enroll their loved one in a care facility for a limited amount of time, that might be another option. But I just think that fear of, like, I might not see my loved one again is a real fear, and it's absolutely something that I worried about in my family when I was talking with my mom about options. And so I would say that's what a good to the man who asked the question. That's what your job is to help them think through that very difficult question and
Hmm.
struggle with it, because there's not a good answer. But I would say there are some practical things, like, temporary enrollment in a long-term care facility, or maybe respite. Those might be some third options that you could think through.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Armstrong, can you add to that?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if I have much more to say other than to say that I have had my own personal experience and have my own. My mother, died of cancer about 17 years ago, and we had a difficult decision of having to make. You know, we can't keep her at home, so we have to put her in a facility. But this mistrust of ultimately the healthcare system, right? Sort of this powerlessness thing, right? Like families, want to have their loved members at home because they have control, if you will, right, over that care, their comfort, and whether it's medications and those kinds of things. And so I think there's just something you relinquish some of that, or there's a belief that you relinquish some of that when you send someone to the hospital. So I totally get it. And so, like Dr. Delgado says, I think again, it's off some of all of those myriad of resources that are available to the wife, right?
Mm.
To give her a peace of mind on feeling good about that decision, if it means that she does transition him, and maybe she just needs the respite, right? But again, also, I don't know if it's a hospice situation or what the situation is, but again, education and
Right.
listening and validating her concerns and need for rest. It's very difficult caring for a loved one, and so really just validating her concerns, but at the same time, helping her to talk through those choices as well, empower her to see that it may be in her benefit, but not that she will relinquish any control. Well, it's risky for sure, but I think just assuring to her that her husband will get care. I mean, definitely it's difficult now, like Dr. Delgado said, all of the ways in which, I guess that just depends on the hospital for sure. But I think, again, talking her through it, helping her, empowering her to make decisions where she has peace about that decision. And at minimum, take the respite. It is so helpful. And I think it helps to revive loved ones in a way that they get that rest and they, can then assume care if that's what they want to do. But also remind her that she has a wonderful support team that is accessible to her, and take advantage of that. Education is always helpful. I find it helped me and my family, and I used that when I became a hospice chaplain. When patients had, and family members had to make those decisions, is talk to them, validate their fears and concerns, and walk with them on their decisions, so they don't feel like they're abandoning their loved one, which is the biggest fear, right?
Right.
And then they'll have guilt if something happens in the hospital. So it's really naming all those fears, and at the same time educating them on what's available, right? So
Right.
yeah, definitely take advantage of all the resources, all the education that you can get to help her walk through that decision.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm also realizing as you're talking about that, there's also what the clergy person or the pastor is going through. I mean, there's a professional
Oh yeah.
relationship between the chaplain and the doctor and the family, but a clergy person or pastor is also intimately engaged in the family system, in this family and in the church. So, how do you relate to the pastor professionally, but also to help him deal with their own sense of grief or loss or fear in this process?
Well, I think, yeah, it's, oftentimes in a hospice situation, one of the first things we find out is if the patient does have a clergy person, right? But what we're finding now, particularly in the midst of this pandemic, clergy are often put on a pedestal, like they can handle everything, right?
Yeah.
And I think what this pandemic is revealing for many of us is that we do need to be mindful of our own grief and our own fears about all of the stuff that's going together, to make sure that everybody feels like they have a place to share their thoughts about whatever the losses mean to them. And I think clergy are no different than that, right? I think one of the things that I offer the clergy that I work with is that I'm here for you too, right?
Right.
As they prepare to ritualize that person's death or provide the care. As many as who could accept that, sometimes it's hard for clergy to be vulnerable, but I say,
Sure.
This is a theological thing. I think it's okay for us to be vulnerable in those spaces and not feel like, we're losing control or some of the things that are barriers to facing our own fears and thoughts and feelings about some of these losses. And I think our care is richer when we enter that process, right? Henry Nouwen's work has been very instrumental in helping me to think through some of those things, right? So, and I try to do that with my students and when I do lectures and things with clergy or pastoral care, to say, hey, we're human too. And so we need to validate that and do some really good self-care and open ourselves up to spaces as care as well, so we can do our work even more powerfully when we are called to care. So.
Thank you. And Dr. Dalgo, I'm wondering, we have to end here soon, but briefly, the relationship between the doctor and the clergy person. How do you understand that during these times?
I think that the relationship is really an integral part of care for the patient. As I said before, I blame Rene Descartes for dividing humans between here and the rest of the body, and I think that physicians and chaplains working together are able to reconnect the mind and the body and really work together for the best of the patient. And so I think that it's an essential relationship. And in our hospital, when we round as a big team, and the chaplains are often a big part of that rounding. And so I think coming together and working together is the only way that we can make it through this time of uncertainty. And we need each other because we're all strapped for time and strapped for emotional resources. And there's the concept of vicarious trauma, or the second victim, and that's the person who is the medical provider or the chaplain who's experiencing that same sort of stress and grief that the family members are undergoing as well. And so I think we recognizing that as professionals and following Henry Nouwen into the wounded healer, I think is our best way to go.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, this creation of sacred community during these significant life transitions is just huge. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. I really want to thank Dr. Armstrong and Dr. Dalgo for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. You've certainly given us a lot to think about as we faithfully confront this crisis together as a sacred community. I'd also like to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in and sharing your questions. As we wrap up our discussion here today, I encourage you to turn your attention to the United Methodist Church's Dismantling Racism Town Hall meeting, beginning just in a few moments at 12 p.m. Central Time. You can view that live discussion on umc.org. So again, thank you. May God bless you. May God bless all of us as we continue to faithfully live into this challenge that we call the pandemic. But from this discussion, I believe that we can indeed create that sacred community that will help us find a way through. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wear your masks.
Thank you.